As a field archaeologist, I've always been concerned by the development around us, which causes great harm by necessity somehow to cultural heritage. Whatever undertaking is carried out, be it a building, the excavation of a ditch, there is a potential great harm for what lies below. No harm is greater than a dam, in the sense that no undertaking reaches so vast an area all at the same time, and somehow for eternity. I mean, dams, of course, are not eternal. It's discussed their range. This is beyond my professional skills, but let's say a figure of 50 to some more years is reasonable. But the damage in between this time span is permanent. I mean, the sites are not just being wet, they are being dug away by water. So you may say that the fate of a site is sealed once the dam is there. There is almost no way back in the distant future. Dams have always been in my mind as one of the greatest threats we faced. Actually, with Bologna University, we did some emergency excavation in a dam area in southeastern Turkey, in the Tahtakupru dam area. We had 2 seasons in 2009-2010 of excavations at Tashlik-Chitoyuk. So when an opportunity arose, Copenhagen University was coordinating a European project under the JPI Cultural Heritage funding line, which we called Heritage and Threat. I enthusiastically endorsed Ingulf Tuesens, the coordinator, proposal to join. And within the project, the Bologna Research Unity researches on the impact of dams in the Near East specifically. Dams usually tended to be very large national undertakings in the past decades. In the Near East especially, they were sponsored by the Soviet Union, which saw these large public works as a sign of its weight in that part of the world, and in all the areas where the race with America was thriving. And nowadays, these large undertakings are dissolved in favor of much smaller but much more diffused dams. So in a way, we witness a decrease in the size of dams and a dramatic increase in the number of dams. So the threat to heritage remains nonetheless extremely high. It is nowadays the World Bank which pursues a policy, mostly the World Bank, similar to that of the Soviet Union in funding these large projects, because it's thought that these large centralized projects may be better managed through the World Bank funding by these the states to which various resources are allocated. Actually, we do think this is not a sound line of reasoning, and we just built this project in order to create a tool for measuring, assessing the impact on landscape by dams project in a new way that can be measured, can be discussed. So we really wanted to produce a scientific tool with which this impact could be measured, and ourselves, we were stunned by the results. The number of dams in the Near East, as can be reconstructed and mapped today, was mainly begun at the start of our project through existing resources. So we confronted data available in the Aquastat project by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the FAO, which gives immediately a quite impressive overview of dams from Iran to Egypt and beyond, of course. I am concerned with the area with which we have worked most. This is not a complete database, so we integrated it through different sources, and basically there is one quite extraordinary body of evidence supplied by the Turkish government. The Devlet Su İşleri, the public work agency of the Turkish government, provides on the web a full access to the information of dams, even prospective dams, dams which are going to be built in the near future. So by working on those data, and data that we started collecting directly on the field. We were able to present very detailed study cases for Turkey. At the same time, we performed a quite accurate mapping of dams in Syria. Of course, everything stalled since the civil war broke out in 2011. But before, in the years before, several smaller projects were carried out, especially in the north and northeast, and Iraq. In Iraq, actually, one large project threatened to submerge Ashur, the site of Ashur, the oldest Assyrian capital. So one of the case studies that we developed was about this Mahul Dam, which may threaten Ashur in the future. Now the project is stalled, evidently because of the general situation and also because of specific concerns about this dam. But we wanted to cover older projects like the Aswan Dam with Nasser Lake, which had an enormous impact. Hundreds of sites were submerged and tens of villages were displaced. And actually the documentation for all this is very patchy, much more patchy than one could think. And also, since it occurred in the 60s, it was especially challenging for us to reconstruct the original layout of sites in an area for which we had no remote sensing tool available. So we wanted to go from these old projects to historical somehow, like the Tabqa Dam and the Ataturk Dam in Turkey, Tabqa Dam and Assad Lake in Syria, and Ataturk Lake in Turkey, to more recent projects which affected the whole course of the Euphrates, for example. I mean, when we say that landscapes have been dramatically affected, one should be reminded that a river like the Euphrates is in practice no more existing as such, because most of its area in Turkey and significantly in Syria has now been affected by artificial lakes created by dams. So in practice, the original stretch of Euphrates in Turkey is almost limited to the 4 kilometers separating the Karkemish Dam from the Syrian border, and some stretch in between Birecik and Ataturk, but it flows in gorges. So you may say that the Euphrates there has been affected somehow too. And this, of course, is quite impressive, and it's not easily understood by the general public. So one of the founding rivers for the development of humankind, of early states and ancient civilizations, is in practice now completely changed and lost for future generations its impact as a river as such. I mean, how could this happen? Well, this is part of a general trend that we try to analyze, and there is a real concern nowadays. There is a shortage of water, there is a necessity of economic development in developing countries. All this creates the narrative according to which cultural heritage can be sacrificed easily, actually easier and easier, in the name of public interest, of needed development, and so on. We do not simply oppose this view. We really want to change the sensitivity of the public towards this. It can be managed. It can be managed in a different way. I'm very sorry to say that the latest dam projects carried out in Turkey, they do not even foresee an archaeological survey, which of course is the first tool to assess how much heritage is going to be lost, is the first tool to gather some documentation about this heritage before it's lost. So if practices are so dramatically changed in these very recent years, I think not only the scientific community but the general public should become aware, should offer solutions, should offer support. It is very well known that in the 60s the Aswan Lake project gathered an international effort to save the antiquities of that area. So several small temples, foremost of course the Abu Simbel one, were moved to safer areas in the nearbys of the lake, or altogether transported abroad, like in Turin, in New York, and so on. as a sign of gratitude of the Egyptian government for the help given in saving those antiquities. But actually, it was only a tiny fraction. Most of the antiquities went lost. So it created a false sense of relief. It is true, something excellent was done, but it was just a fraction of what was going to be lost anyway. The UNESCO calls for help in dam areas was mainly based on an offer that half of the antiquities retrieved were going to be allotted to the funding sponsor, foreign funding sponsor, for example. This was done in the hope of attracting more interest, more support for antiquities that were going to be lost anyway. The case of Turkey is peculiar because they never subscribed to this policy. They basically carry out emergency excavations under museum directorship. So scientific partners can only gain, which is customary for us but not for all the institutions, scientific credit upon their participation. This, of course, somehow limits foreign support to these policies.
As well known, remote sensing is the technique to survey an area by satellite imagery, multispectral satellite imagery. Multispectral refers to the fact that the images acquired by satellites are not only in the visible part of the spectrum of the light, but also covering different parts like infrared, thermal, infrared, and so on. Thanks to these multispectral properties, we are able, starting from satellite imagery, to classify an area, to detect the different kinds of coverage on an area. And the satellites can provide periodic acquisition of an area with good resolution today. Resolution refers to the area covered by each pixel in the image. And thanks to this information, we can provide today a multi-temporal analysis of an area, because we are a lot of images along the time, and we can study the changes occurred on a territory. In specific, in this project, we were able to automatically or semi-automatically recognize the water on the images and then delineate the area covered by the flooding after the dam's establishment in Turkey or in other countries. And in this way, we were able to overlay, to intersect this information in respect to other data. For instance, in this case, the existence of archaeological sites that were damaged or flooded, completely flooded after the dam's establishment. In specific for this project, we used the satellite imagery mainly from the Landsat mission acquired in the last 30 years, or more than 30 years, and thanks to this information, we were able to detect the changes occurred in time after the establishment of the dams. And we used also not only satellite imagery, but also different kinds of information, old maps, and different sources like surveys made by archaeologists, some scientific literature, and also different satellite imagery, not for Earth observation, but declassified imagery, originally made for military purposes. And all these different data sets today are digital, and then we were able to put all the data in a geographical information system. Geographic Information System, GIS, is a software system able to manage together different kinds of data and perform analysis and perform studies along the time. Thanks to the analytics capability of a GIS, we are now able to have an assessment, an objective assessment about the flooded areas and the influence on the archaeological sites and the cultural heritage. And then this is numerical results, and then not subjective, but is strictly numerical and objective.
Aswan is the last biggest city of Egypt and is located in the southern part of the country. It is at about 350 kilometers north in respect of the Sudanese border. And it is one of the most important cities of the country. One of the characteristics of this city is the first cataract, which is a granite system of rocks which is inside the river Nile, which flows from the Ethiopian country to the end of the Egypt in the north. In order to develop this project, we used different sources because we need to collect the correct data. Our basis is a GIS project in which we collected information such as satellite images, photographic images too, for example the corona, which refers to the 60s, for example. Again, we used many cartographic materials produced by the Egyptian government and published in different years. Moreover, we used and we relied on the publication materials which has been published by the different missions which worked in the Aswan and in the Nubian region. The first Aswan Dam was built between 1898 and 1902. It was then raised in 1912 and 1934, and these operations led to the submersion of huge areas along the banks of the Nile. However, the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 60s caused a greater impact both on the landscape and on the archaeological heritage of the region. The dam was built between 1960 and 1965, 6 kilometers south in respect of the first dam, and created the biggest artificial lake in the world, which is Lake Nasser. Lake Nasser covers an area 500 kilometers long, and this area extends from Aswan in the north and in Egypt to the second cataract region in the south, which is already in Sudan. For the special analysis of the territory, we collected data from various sources, such as publications, reports, or online sources too. On the basis of this data, we can say that at least 1/3 of the territory, which is now flooded by Lake Nasser, has not been properly surveyed. This means that we have no information about the possible existence of archaeological sites in these areas. Moreover, and again basing on our data, we have at least 1,150 archaeological sites which have been destroyed, completely destroyed, or dismantled and relocated in other areas. When we think about the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 60s and the creation of Lake Nasser, everyone has in mind the rescue operations involving the great Egyptian temples which were built along the Nile banks. Abu Simbel, Philae or Essebua are among the most famous temples which were dismantled and rebuilt in safer areas or offered as gifts by the Egyptian government to other countries. But many other sites have not been saved. For example, necropolis, settlement areas, rock art locations and churches have been examined, documented and excavated in the best possible cases, but not rescued. Unfortunately, we are aware that at least 1/3 of the area which is now covered by the lake has not been surveyed at all, and this means that we have no information regarding these regions which now do not exist anymore.
according to FAO, there are currently more than 1,200 of active dams in the Near East, and with Near East we mean a huge area extending from Turkey to Iran and from Armenia to Yemen. And this is very important because we know that most of these dams did not receive a proper archaeological, proper interest, let's say, in terms of cultural heritage and archaeology. It is in fact important to stress that national policies and strategies during the construction of dams didn't properly consider the importance of the heritage, and this caused the loss of a huge number of archaeological sites. For our project, we selected the Euphrates River as one of the best examples of areas where the cultural heritage and the archaeological sites in particular have been deeply, heavily damaged by the construction of dams and all the related facilities. The Euphrates River is about 2,800 kilometers long, and it stretches from Turkey through Syria and until Iraq. And along this very long path, in the last 50 years, more than 9 dams and also barrages have been constructed, the majority of which are in Turkey. For our project, we used different types of sources, from digital open access sources to archaeological reports, in order to create a base map containing all the details of the dams themselves and the archaeological sites documented by the archaeologists. One of the most interesting cases of this research is the Ataturk Dam. This dam was constructed during the 1970s, and the water upfill continued till 1990. The result of the water upfilling created the third biggest lake in Turkey. And in terms of impact on the cultural heritage, this was particularly important and dramatic, we would say. We calculated that at least 186 archaeological sites have been flooded or damaged because of the water upfilling. Among these sites, there are some important centers for the history of Turkey, and we can say also for the world in general. We may just quote some of them, like the prehistoric site of Nevelichori, or the ancient city of Samsat, which was one of the key centers in the region at different times under the Hittites and in the Hellenistic period and so forth. But what is also very important is that at least the 40% of the area has not been properly surveyed by the archaeologists, and because of the presence of meters and meters of water now in that area, we we have to say that all the cultural heritage in that area is lost forever. So in our study we also wanted to not just to document what has been done, but also what has not been done, and so what is lost.
Samsat is the ancient Roman city of Samosata, and it's was located on the Euphrates, into the stretch between the middle and the upper Euphrates, just south of the Taurus range. The valley in the Samsat area was wider, and so Samsat was surrounded by flat fields in a very fertile environment. The case of Samsat is especially painful, not only because of the historical importance of the site, but also because this is one of the examples where research and need and urgency didn't match well together at all. Samsat is a huge mound of an elongated shape. It was very high, almost 40 meters high, and it was surrounded by a lower town, limited by the earthen ramparts built at the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, possibly more ancient still. Samsat witnessed an incredibly long time span of occupation, ranging from the 4th millennium at least down into the medieval times, with almost no break in between. From an archaeological point of view, thus it was a treasure trove, especially because it has been a regional capital for most of its history. So it was an incredibly important site at all periods. This, of course, creates an additional concern in an archaeological exploration because of the hardships that an excavation director incurs in when digging such a pluristratified site. Actually, the site would have needed an international effort. The site was enormous. It's precisely one of the sister sites in terms of its archaeology and urban shape of Carchemish on the Euphrates further downstream. Samsat was around 120 hectares wide. Nowadays it lies below, we have calculated between 40 and 60 meters of water, the top of the Acropolis, so it's beyond any possible reach and control, exactly in the middle of the Ataturk Lake. So it's completely lost. I think the water reached this extent in the mid-90s, and the site was excavated since the 80s by a single expedition, which of course was an unfortunate decision, because the expedition led by two great masters of Anatolian archaeology, Tassin and Mehmet Özgüç, was completely not enough to investigate such an important site. Some soundings were carried out in the decades before by an American expedition, but the reality is that this enormous site was only lightly touched by the great efforts that the Özgüç certainly put into this project. But the overall results are disappointing in the sense that this incredible site went completely lost. At Samsat, you could find Uruk period, which is end of the 4th millennium, clay cones in hundreds at the base of the tell. Clay cones do characterize monumental architecture from this late Chalcolithic phase. So temples and public buildings had facades decorated by these cones in southern Iraq. Uruk is the most famous site for the period. But at Samsat, which most probably, but we don't know in fact, was a colony of the Uruk period on the Euphrates, like other colonies which were investigated in the Tapka Dam area, like Habuba Kebir and Jebel Aruda. Samsat must have been an outpost of southerners already at the end of the 4th millennium BC. Then the step trench made by the Özgüç exposed a long 3rd millennium sequence, a Middle Bronze Age, which means early 2nd millennium BC palace, and it goes down until the Hellenistic age, where you have a royal palace with frescoes and mosaics. It's amazing, the architecture of this period and of these earlier periods, which of course is only known in limited exposures. But the quality of the objects found at Samsat is really, really outstanding. The inscription, hieroglyphic inscriptions, the classical inscriptions, the medieval inscriptions, because of course even beyond the Hellenistic and Roman time, Samsat remained the most important Byzantine and beyond fortified site. So all this testifies to a loss which is irreplaceable. The loss of Samsat can be ranked among the most painful ones ever induced by dams.
Zeugma is one of the most important archaeological sites submerged by the Birchik Dam. Together with the ancient city of Apamea on the Euphrates, it created a twin city, which was one of the main centers of the Imperial Roman period. This was a kind of icon of what has been lost due to the construction of dams. Excavations at the site has been carried out since 1990s, and they revealed an outstanding amount of mosaics and a very impressive city with different types of buildings. What is important to stress was for example, what has been done for Zeugma has not been done instead for its twin city, Apamea, which now lies under the water without proper explorations. So proper strategies for safeguard, for document these sites has not been fully carried out. What any tourist can see today if he or she visits the site of Zeugma is just a very small part of the huge efforts and excavations that have been done in order to save this city.
The ancient city of Zeugma, it was founded in 300 BC as a Greek settlement by Seleucus I, one of the generals of Alexander the Great, who ruled over Syria. The Greek word Zeugma means bond, and the city had in fact a twin settlement on the opposite bank of the river and was one of the main crossing points along the trade routes between the west and the east. In the 1st century BC, Zeugma became part of the Roman Empire, and starting as mainly a military garrison, flourished then as one of the richest in the region in the 2nd and 3rd century. In 252, the city was sacked by the Sasanian army and lost its prominence. It fell then into the territory of the Byzantine Empire and continued its life as an Islamic settlement from the 10th century.
We can say at least that part of this lost heritage has been saved and brought to life with the transportation of several mosaics, Zeugma Museum in Gaziantep, and the current display helps to have a broad idea of what was the ancient city and its beautiful mosaics.
We embarked on this project with an adventurous spirit. It has been a great adventure for us, going through this evidence which we didn't expect was going to unfold in this way, which is actually the spirit of research. Now we have some ideas on what should be done in the future. The present situation is worrying, most worrying, I would say. I can only hope that in the future policymakers become wiser, they consider wider models of intervention, of protection, of preservation. The needs of communities which are being eradicated from areas to be flooded should be considered even more strictly. Much has been done in respect to the 60s. In the 60s, It was a humanitarian disaster, you would say, in some cases, such for the Aswan Dam and all the Nubian communities. But situation has improved, of course, but much more needs to be done. Several new settlements are unfavorable. Communities have lost a feeling of belonging. So this should be addressed with greater concern. But what we really hope now is that some systematic study, which has not been carried out thus far, is implemented in evaluating the costs and benefits of dams. Of course, the dam can give immediate relief and gains in terms of energy production, water supply to agricultural areas, and this is, of course, a benefit. But the cost of what is being lost in terms of cultural heritage and potential touristic development, which is lost, and in terms of agricultural production, which gets lost because usually it's the best fields who are being flooded, this should be done with the same standards, not with different standards, which means economical. The nation, the people of the area concerned by projects of new dams should be informed precisely of what we are going to gain and what we're going to lose in economic terms, not just emotionally, because otherwise our arguments are usually dismissed by the needs of development countries especially. And I hope that this policy is implemented at all levels, national levels because the communities are most affected, but also in terms of World Bank institution, for example, which is funding the dams, and similar bodies international. This, I think, is most needed and most promising avenue of research if it will be carried out. While we are talking, dams are being constructed, areas are being flooded more and more, in the Near East especially, which is the area we studied, and elsewhere. We realized not enough is being done now, currently. We should change quickly our sets of standard and routine operations on the field. Better and wider documentation needs to be done. This, of course, is technically viable, very, very viable. How this can be done? We realized there have been serious lacks in past surveys for several reasons, in many cases completely independently from the efforts of scholars involved. Nowadays, I think we should have a more coordinated effort. There should be more economic incentives for digging as much as possible. I'm now confining myself to archaeological heritage, but of course there are many other kinds of heritage which needs to be addressed, environmental, social, geological, and so on. This, of course, we should have an integral view of how document these areas. They should be completely investigated. And archaeological surveys should not confine themselves to mounds, but to the whole territory. This is basic, it's most important. We should document all the flooded areas, not just the emergence that we see. How can this be done? Well, we need certainly more money from construction bodies. More money should be allocated in projects to this end. So governments should be involved, not just directly supporting national groups, but all groups. And at the same time, the old idea of giving a half of the fines to intervening bodies may be an incentive, because too few nations are responding to appeals. In many cases nowadays, appeals are no more made, and this also is disaster. So there should be more attention in the cultural authorities of the single nations and of international organs towards this. For example, I think that if all expeditions active in one country dedicate, before the start of their work, 1 or 2 weeks of an intensive survey of a sector of the dam, this may just give an immediate benefit. Of course, there should be operational bases ready on the field, provided by governments, but this is technically possible. One should just find the political will. Things can be made much better now, quickly, with very simple steps. So we can just hope that this work of ours, measuring and assessing the extent of the damage and of the loss in archaeological terms, but of course there is much more beside that, can show the way, can open a new path in intervention in dam areas.